very well attended conference today, certainly reflecting the interest on the topic, and I guess for both of us as representing Canadian institutions, a very important topic for the Canadians as well.
Very important topic. I think when we look at the Canadian services sector in particular, where I specialize, oil and gas activity in Colombia is very, very important. Canadian companies are more and more looking to diversify their revenue streams, expand internationally, and Colombia has been an area where a significant volume of Canadian producers and Canadian service companies have fought hard to establish a presence down here because it's a rapidly growing market, and over the next couple of years we see Canada entering some challenging periods.
Yeah, it certainly tries to replicate the model that we have seen before in the Canadian market as well in some parts of the US market, where you have the smaller independents kind of leading the way, then maybe going through a wave of consolidation, creating larger companies, and certainly you see a lot of these names being listed on the TSX, so the Canadian component of the Colombian upstream is actually quite large.
Yeah, and there's a lot of similarities between the Canadian market and the Colombian market, in particular the smaller producers that you're talking about and the access to capital that the Canadian markets bring. That's been long-standing a Canadian model with smaller companies building up their companies and slowly getting access to capital and being eventually acquired because they are strategic.
Recent performance, at least for the TSX listed independent producers, hasn't really been that great. So certainly access to capital is an issue for a lot of these companies. Some of them don't yet have the maturity to tap the capital markets, but there is also, from my perception at least, a very strong bank market within Colombia composed of local banks that are well capitalized, international banks that have specialized in oil and gas financing that are providing capital to the industry. But is that also the case for some of the service companies? It's certainly the case for the upstream companies.
From a public capital perspective, I think it's somewhat challenging for the service companies right now, just given access to capital. Valuations are quite depressed. But on the private capital side, private equity activity has been robust in the energy services industry, particularly where companies have diversified revenue streams outside of Canada.
It seems that one of the new challenges for Colombia is also to enter new frontiers, let's say go in some of the unconventional production. Is that something where you also feel that the service industry is already gearing up for to provide the service required, particularly by the majors who hopefully going to play a significant role in that?
Absolutely, and I think technology is going to drive development to those reserves. Similar to what we've seen in Canada and the US, technology will adapt to be able to increase reserves, increase production for oil and gas companies.
So I think, at least from my point of view, that despite the currently depressed valuations, it's certainly an industry that here in Colombia has a great future. There is an abundance of exploration targets out there, and once you see these companies either merging or capitalizing themselves to enter these markets, I certainly feel that we should see a rebound on valuations.
I would agree wholeheartedly.
Is that something we can work with?
Yeah, that's something we can definitely work with, but I have a couple more short topics.
Good.
President Obama said that he wanted to save on energy. How do you see those sorts of decisions affecting developing countries like Colombia?
You mean like energy policy gearing towards renewable energies?
Yeah, we could do that. Towards renewable.
Well, that's kind of difficult because Colombia is not a big exporter of, let's say, neither crude or gas, so it's really not that relevant for Colombia.
Okay.
It would be relevant if you have a decision, if you have like a policy here in Colombia where the government here in Colombia is pressing to replace fossil fuels.
Okay.
Well, I think energy independence in the U.S. is certainly something that will affect.
Yeah, that's why if we talk about energy independence.
Yeah. So, I mean, energy independence in the U.S. With Obama and the initiative to make the United States energy independent, I think it's important to differentiate energy independence and crude independence, because for the next number of years, even with large production increases in the Bakken and Eagle Ford basins in the U.S., they are going to require significant volumes of crude imports. And being Canadian, they're our number one. We supply a lot of crude to the United States, and I think Colombia supplies a fair bit as well. It's going to be important for them to rationalize where they get their crude from. I think to the extent they can get them from get the crude from countries that share similar, values, have political stability, social.
Growing demand coming out of Asian markets. So to the extent that Colombia is investing in infrastructure that would allow exports of crude and potentially liquefied natural gas to Asian markets, that's certainly an important factor. On the other hand, you also have a growing demand for natural gas as a fuel replacement for diesel and bunker in the Caribbean. So to the extent that there are certain projects underway, to the extent that these projects materialize, Colombia could play an important role to provide natural gas to Caribbean off-takers. So I think there's certainly an international market that can develop for Colombia.